This video lecture will be a discussion of risk control. Most of the information comes from CPCU Assignment or Chapter 3. In this video lecture, we'll discuss risk control techniques, risk control goals, an application of risk control techniques to various types of exposures, and business continuity management. So let's start with risk control techniques. The various control techniques that are available to businesses and individuals are avoidance, loss prevention, loss reduction, separation, duplication, and diversification. Let's start with a look at avoidance. Remember that avoidance is not engaging in an activity or not purchasing an asset. Avoidance that is effective should reduce the probability of loss to 0. So avoidance doesn't just reduce frequency, it eliminates the possibility of loss. And so therefore, it is the most effective way to manage a loss exposure. Also, avoidance can be proactive or reactive. Proactive avoidance would be the decision not to engage in an activity or not to purchase an asset, whereas reactive avoidance would be abandoning a project or selling off an asset. Reactive avoidance might result in some residual loss, such as if you sell off a property, you might still be liable for asbestos exposure from the time that you actually owned the property. While avoidance is the most effective way to manage a loss exposure, it's actually not very realistic. It's not the most common, and it's not the most feasible or even desirable way to control risk. As we've discussed many times, with no risks comes no rewards, and business is all about taking risks and achieving goals and getting rewards. However, you should avoid an activity or exposure if the expected losses outweigh the expected benefits. Now let's discuss loss prevention. Remember that loss prevention is aimed at reducing the frequency or probability of losses, but it doesn't eliminate the loss. What are some examples of loss prevention for your business? And of course, your business is the business that you're going to be doing your risk assessment on this semester. By now, you should realize that the quiz questions that I ask require you to think about your business, and many times I'll ask you to give examples from the business. This might force you to think through the operations, the day-to-day activities of the business, and the assets that it owns. Some common examples are fire, slips and falls, and employee theft. What kinds of exposures to these different perils does your business have? Note that loss prevention is generally related to the cause of loss, trying to prevent fire from ever occurring, or individuals from slipping and falling on your property, or your employees from stealing from you. Those things that prevent loss also may reduce severity. Also, take a look at Heinrich's domino theory. This is on page 3.7 of the textbook. Though this theory is quite dated at this point, it was from 1931. He did a thorough analysis of work injuries, and he determined that there was a series of events, or dominoes, that led to the ultimate worker injury. And he noted that if any of these dominoes were removed from the chain that led to the loss, that the loss would never have occurred. Some of these were related to human error, and some were mechanical. And oftentimes, it's easier to remove mechanical problems rather than to prevent human error. Now let's briefly discuss loss reduction. Loss reduction reduces the severity of losses and sometimes also the frequency. The sprinkler system is a good example of loss reduction. Loss reduction can be pre-loss and post-loss. So pre-loss reduction means things like installing a sprinkler system or making sure that your office is clutter-free and that your electrical systems are safe and up to date. Examples of post-loss reduction are implementing emergency procedures once a loss has occurred, rehabilitation activities, especially for workers' comp, employee injuries, and public relations. This is especially important in today's social media and news environment where public information is readily available to a widespread group of people. And providing a legal defense. The more expert your legal defense, the better chance of a loss reduction in liability. Now let's discuss separation. Separation is only appropriate if an organization can operate only a portion of separate units intact. A common example of where separation can be used is having separate warehouses. In other words, if you have significant inventory, you might keep that inventory in separate warehouses. I've seen mortgage companies that keep the physical copies of mortgages in one warehouse, but they have a very sophisticated fire detection system. And if there's any sign of fire or smoke, walls go down that actually separate the different units of the warehouse. This separation means that one peril, such as a fire, will not damage a significant amount of property. Separating reduces severity at each location, but actually increases the frequency of losses. So this might be a little bit difficult to understand, but think about the fact that if there are multiple different locations where property is stored, then there's a greater chance that a single tornado will hit one of those locations. Still, this might be an effective tool because it reduces the overall severity. Duplication means having backups, spares, or copies, such as keys or technology. This is only appropriate if the consequence of loss of an asset or activity justifies the expense of duplication. You wouldn't want to have two totally separate law offices or accounting offices doing exactly the same thing. But for a manufacturing firm or a restaurant, you might want two separate pieces of equipment or two freezers, because if one goes down, the other one can be used. Another example might be a truck that you keep in the garage, so that in the event that the truck that you normally use to transport property has an accident, you have a second source of transportation. Think about critical risks especially. Those that if the asset is damaged or unusable would potentially result in the organization's failure or at least cause you to halt operations temporarily. Duplication is not as likely to increase frequency as separation. This is because normally the duplicated item is kept in storage, like the vehicle that would be kept in a garage, so it's not as vulnerable or exposed to potential loss as the primary item. Next is diversification. Diversification resembles duplication and separation, but it's more commonly applied to business risks rather than hazard risks. In fact, some things can be diversification and duplication, or diversification and separation. For example, operating at multiple locations could be viewed as duplication or even separation, but the purpose of diversification is making sure that you have separate sources of business income. If, for example, you have a chain of donut shops, and because of construction, people are unable to get to your donut shop, you still have income coming in from the other donut shop. So this could be viewed as both duplication and diversification. A more obvious example of diversification is selling or offering additional products or services. So instead of just selling donuts, you might decide to also sell lower calorie items. This is especially important when you consider market risks and demographics, and that people's preferences for different things change over time. In general, risk control techniques can be grouped into those that reduce frequency, which are, of course, avoidance and loss prevention, which also usually reduce severity, especially avoidance, and those that reduce loss severity, reduction, separation, duplication, and diversification. In reality, separation, duplication, and diversification are really subcategories of loss reduction and loss prevention. Normally, though, they're focused on loss reduction. But because the three don't fit neatly into the category of loss reduction, I looked at them separately. Now let's discuss risk control goals. We'll talk about implementing effective and efficient risk control measures, complying with legal requirements, promoting life safety, and ensuring business continuity. But before we do, let's briefly talk about how risk control goals support organizational goals. Every organization has its overall goals. Most people think of the primary goal for an organization to be making money, but it might also be to employ your family members or friends. It might be to make a difference in your community and to help people. Whatever your organizational goals, your risk management goals must support those organizational goals. And your risk management goals can be split into risk control goals and risk financing goals. We'll discuss risk financing goals in the next chapter or assignment. Risk control goals focus on implementing effective and efficient risk control measures, complying with legal requirements, promoting life safety, and ensuring business continuity. So those are the 4 areas that we'll now discuss. So first, to implement effective and efficient risk control measures, what does it mean that the goals should be effective? It means that they should enable an organization to achieve their desired goals. And this seems like common sense, but it's all too often ignored. Remember from RMIN 205, we discussed pre-loss and post-loss goals. Pre-loss goals were things that focused on cash flow and cost-benefit analysis, tolerance of uncertainty, and meeting legal requirements, whereas post-loss goals focus on business continuity and reducing earnings volatility and continuing to be a profitable business. In order to ensure that your risk control measures are effective and efficient, businesses often use cash flow analysis to compare 2 different possibilities or 2 value maximizing decisions to see which one is most value maximizing. Again, much of this seems like common sense, but all too often it's ignored by many businesses, especially small businesses. Next, complying with legal requirements. While complying with legal requirements can be a major annoyance to some businesses, at least the legal requirements are outlined, and there are numerous resources for determining what those legal requirements are and how they change over time. Many legal requirements protect employees, such as OSHA and ADA, and HIPAA and ACA. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which has very detailed requirements for various business operations to protect the health and safety of employees. The ADA is, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability Act, and the ACA is the Affordable Care Act, of course. Others protect the environment, such as the Clean Air Act. Let's look at the EPA.gov. The EPA, or U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, has a significant amount of information related to the regulations that affect various types of businesses. Notice over here, education, healthcare, manufacturing, mining, oil and gas, and of course, agriculture, automotive, utilities, construction, etc. So there's a significant amount of information about important regulations and risk control at the EPA's website here. A big part of compliance is keeping up with laws and amendments. So sites like the EPA can be very helpful, as well as the SBA, which is the Small Business Administration. The SBA keeps track of business laws and regulations related to employment and labor laws, antitrust laws, and a variety of other laws, environmental regulations, advertising laws, finance laws, and having an online business that might impact a small business. While complying with legal requirements can seem somewhat complicated, a business doesn't have to go too far or necessarily hire an attorney to find resources to help them stay in compliance with the law and regulations. Next, promoting life safety should be part of an organization's risk control goals. And of course, this is for employees and others, such as consumers, customers, people who come onto your property, and many others. Much of promoting life safety is focused on fire safety. The National Fire Protection Association has a significant amount of information related to controlling the hazards related to fire safety. And of course, the amount of time that an organization spends on promoting life safety depends a great deal on the nature of the organization. Several of you have already noted in your quizzes how some businesses have to focus on the protection of consumers much more so than others. Next, ensuring business continuity. This means to minimize or eliminate significant business interruptions. Another key buzzword that is often used today is sustainability, or the phrase business sustainability. Another is business perpetuation. About 50% of small businesses actually fail in the first 5 years, according to the Small Business Administration. Let's take a look at an important document that the Small Business Administration puts out every year. Notice that small firms represent 99.7% of all employer firms. They do only make up about 43% of total U.S. payroll, but they have generated 65% of net new jobs over the past 17 years, and 43% of payroll is significant. However, 7 out of 10 of new employer firms survive at least 2 years, half at least 5 years, and a third at least 10 years, and only a quarter stay in business 15 years or more. Obviously, not all of the failures are related to hazard risks, but all of the failures are related to risk and need to be managed, especially for a small business. So there's really no better argument for small businesses paying attention to risk management than what you read right here. Now let's look at applications of risk control techniques. First, for property loss exposures. These should be divided into tangible, both real and tangible personal, and intangible property exposures like goodwill and intellectual property. Especially for tangible loss exposures, risk managers often use the COPE method, looking at construction, occupancy, protection, which is primarily related to fire protection, and external exposure. So what materials and how fire resistive are the materials that the building is made of? What types of individuals occupy the building? Protection primarily relates to the access fire departments have to the property. And external exposure relates to the neighboring buildings. Even the difference between being close to a restaurant with a fire source and a retail store can be significant when it comes to external exposure. Next, consider liability loss exposures. Simply put, there are 3 risk control techniques when it comes to liability. Avoiding the activity that creates the exposure, decreasing the likelihood of losses occurring, or, if a loss does occur, minimizing its effect on the organization, loss reduction, which of course often occurs post-loss. A liability can be the most significant loss exposure for any organization, because it's not just your property or personnel that could be injured or damaged. It's anyone who comes in contact with the business. So it's extremely important that an organization, no matter what the size, pays close attention to managing liability loss exposures through risk control. Then there's personnel loss exposures. Education, training, and implementing and enforcing safety measures are some of the best ways that personnel loss exposures can be managed. For example, using a body harness or wearing goggles. These are especially useful with construction and manufacturing organizations. Take a look at these statistics from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Notice first that fatal injuries involving contractors accounted for 17% of all fatal work injuries in 2014. And then they talk about construction's fatal 4. Out of 4,386 worker fatalities in calendar year 2014, 899, or 20.5%, 1 in 5, were in construction. And the leading causes of worker deaths were falls, electrocution, being struck by an object, and being caught in between. And these fatal 4 were responsible for the majority of those deaths. OSHA makes a strong argument for the fact that falls, electrocutions, being struck by an object, and being caught in between could have been prevented with relatively simple prevention measures. Next and last, net income loss exposures. A net income loss exposure can be associated with any of the prior 3. Compared to what we think of for individuals and families, a business's net income loss exposure can be very significant and must be paid attention to. Separation and duplication are directly aimed at reducing the severity of net income loss exposures, so they can be a very good tool here. Our survey research in the past has shown that net income loss exposures are often ignored by businesses, and yet they seem to result in some of the most significant losses along with liabilities. Last, let's look at business continuity management. Business continuity management means minimizing organizational disruptions. And as we said before, it's often referred to as sustainability or perpetuation. So we'll talk first about the scope of business continuity management. Business continuity management became very popular in the 1990s with a focus primarily on IT issues. But it also now focuses on property, human failures, loss of utilities or infrastructure, reputation losses, and personnel losses. Reputation, along with IT, continues to be some of the most significant areas of focus for businesses, primarily for large corporate entities. But today, more and more small businesses are highly dependent on information systems, and because of easy access to information provided by the internet and social media, small businesses are much more susceptible to reputation losses. So the business continuity process, very similar to the risk management process in general, is to identify the organization's critical functions, identify the risks or threats to those, evaluate the effect of those risks on the critical functions, and then develop a business continuity strategy, and develop a written plan and communicate it to all relevant parties. This business continuity plan should be developed and communicated before an incident occurs. All too often, when a business continuity plan is even written, and you'll find that most businesses don't even develop a plan, but those that are developed are sometimes stuck in drawers and never communicated to the employees. A business continuity plan should include all of these elements: direction and control, communications, life safety, how to protect your property, including your records, community outreach, involving organizations such as United Way and the Red Cross, and government organizations, recovery and restoration, including your insurance policies, employee support, resuming operations overall, and administration and logistics. All of these should be considered when planning for an emergency. But not all business continuity losses are related to an emergency. Even an everyday accident can have a significant impact on a small business. The most important thing is that the business continuity plan be communicated to all relevant parties. An officer or key person who takes great pains to develop a business continuity plan and doesn't communicate it to all of his employees is wasting his time. And that's the end of our discussion of risk control.